Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
No. Up here. You gotta turn it on.
Oh, hello.
Now we're good to go.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Better?
Yes.
Thank you.
Welcome everybody to the second event in our series leading up to the primary elections. Today we're joined by Senator Liz Krueger, who will be running unopposed for the Democratic nomination, but that doesn't mean she doesn't want to earn your vote anyhow, because that's the kind of person she is. She serves as the chair of the Finance Committee and also serves on the Budget and Revenue Committee, Rules Committee, and Legislative Women's Caucus. Because of the breaking news with the Supreme Court today, we're going to begin with those issues and then move on to senior and aging related issues later in the program. So, welcome.
Thank you very much.
How are you doing today?
You know, it's a beautiful day, and the view from this room, people who can't see it, is amazing. So I definitely like the venue. Thank you.
You're setting me up for the resiliency questions later.
Oh, okay, fine.
But right now, I'd like to talk about the breaking news on guns. So today, for those who haven't seen the news already, the Supreme Court essentially invalidated New York's concealed carry law by finding that Americans have a right to request a permit, whether or not they can show cause for needing that permit. And this could result in a flood of guns into the streets of New York that were previously not there because the state is not able to deny people those guns any longer. So I'd like to ask the senator, what are we going to do about this?
Well, first of all, I knew this decision was coming from the Supreme Court. I think many of us following the case did. But it's a horrendous decision out of a new horrendous court, in my opinion. And it's really going to create a crisis for New York City in particular, and apparently about 5 other states who had almost identical laws. So here in New York City, which is still, despite some increase in crime, one of the safest places in the United States of America, the safest big city. And one of the reasons I believe that we have the most safety is because we don't let people walk around with guns. Now, I know that we have a Second Amendment and people believe they have the right to guns. I don't think the forefathers were really thinking of handguns in New York City in 2022, but leaving that alone, this decision means we all could pick up handguns and start carrying them with us wherever we go. Now, if you look at the statistics on what happens when there are more guns available, it's not the good guys versus the bad guys in shootouts, the way you might believe it in movies or TV shows or even some newspapers like the New York Post. It is mostly people ending up shooting themselves or their families, children getting the guns and shooting each other. It is domestic violence situations where someone dies versus perhaps another terrible storyline in domestic violence, but not someone shooting each other. So more guns means more people will die in violent incidents, mostly not criminals on the streets, because yes, criminals do choose to get guns regardless of our laws, and apparently it's not that hard because now you can print them up and make them at home, which is terrifying in its own right. So this decision isn't going to increase the likelihood of criminals carrying guns. It will increase the likelihood of people who choose to have guns with them, easily accessible, not locked up, that those guns will be used intentionally or not intentionally for tragic circumstances. So what can New York do? We may go back into what's called extraordinary session, which is a special term when we're not in normal session, but the governor can call the legislature back, and she may be giving us new bills to consider. Now, the Supreme Court only made their decision today, so we have a big meeting later on tonight to talk about what legislation we think we could pass that would help us. And there's 2 theories on that. One is we just go ahead and pass something that we think is the right answer, but we know this Supreme Court would eventually shoot down. But we say, well, it would take a good 4 or 5 years to get through the courts before this Supreme Court would get their hands on it again, and maybe they'll be gone by then. So that's one theory. And the other theory is we could try to fine-tune legislation so that we are perhaps defining away almost any place in New York City where you would be allowed to carry a gun. For example, we could try to pass laws that say that open gun rule doesn't apply in schools, in universities, in hospitals, in libraries, in senior facilities, in the subways, on a bus, in government buildings, in libraries. Did I say libraries already? So you basically could try, in public parks, you could try to remove almost everywhere in the 5 boroughs from where you're allowed to carry guns, and perhaps get a very similar outcome to the law we've already been living with in this city for decades and decades without any real problem. Because of course, in New York City, there are people who file an application for a gun permit, a carry permit. And so there are some people, other than the police, who do get permission to carry guns, but they have to make a very good argument for it, for the reason for it. They have to show their sanity, their ability to handle a gun, to have training, to lock it up safely. And so the gun permit law didn't zero out private guns, but limited them dramatically more than in states that have no laws. So for example, Texas, everybody's walking around with guns. And their violence statistics are terrifying. They don't have lower crime because people are walking around with guns. They just have more violence because people are walking around with guns. So I'm hoping, Chris, that we will come up with a good collection of answers and move legislation quickly.
Thank you. Do you know, back to the idea of banning guns in locations like senior facilities, is there any legal precedent for using not just the facility itself, but a perimeter around it that could essentially exclude open carry from all of New York?
I don't know. We certainly have other state laws that use perimeters for other purposes, so it's not an unprecedented concept in our state law. I'm just not sure, I don't know, because I'm just not sure how far we can go. Thank you for the proposal. We're all staring at that.
I'm here all night.
Okay. Well, no, we're all staring at that Supreme Court decision saying, what did they do? How did they write it? And what room does it leave us to create state laws and city laws in this case that will protect us despite the Supreme Court?
Staying with the Supreme Court added a decision day for tomorrow, which for those of us following the calendar, we know that's it's unusual because decision days have not tended to go past Thursday, which means this could be, and is likely, the final decision day. And we've already seen a draft that's been leaked overturning Roe versus Wade. That means that as of tomorrow at 10 a.m., we could lose Roe versus Wade. What are we going to do here in New York to protect Roe versus Wade's protections in our laws to ensure that people don't lose their rights as soon as next week?
Thank you for that question. So reproductive rights and reproductive health have been a primary focus for my life long before I became a state senator. And nobody in this room is a kid, so we've all lived through a 50-year period where a woman and her healthcare provider could make the decision about whether she wanted to become pregnant, continue a pregnancy, or end a pregnancy. That law that Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, went into effect in 1973. And since then, while there are different states who have passed different kinds of laws, it was mostly just assumed this was settled law, the Supreme Court spoke, and we have these rights and protections in the United States of America. And then a relatively small group, if you look at the public opinion polls, decided that they were going to take on trying to reverse this decision by coordinating with some other people who didn't even necessarily care about this issue, but were trying to build a voting bloc. And so they worked through state capitals to move legislation that was in direct violation of Roe v. Wade, and they knew they were passing laws that were in direct violation of Roe v. Wade, and they did it intentionally, trying to get their law into Supreme Court cases and hoping and planning that by the time they got to the Supreme Court, the court would have been changed enough with replacement judges who were not just fundamentally more conservative, but judges who actually said, before they were made Supreme Court judges, yes, I promise I will overturn Roe v. Wade. Even though judges aren't supposed to take positions before they see a case. But our three newest judges to the court basically all took oaths to overturn this decision. And since the decision has leaked several weeks ago before tomorrow's likely decision, we pretty much know what it's going to say. And we now have 26 states in this country out of 50 states who have passed laws that would radically reduce women's access to abortion and contraception or completely do away with it. So what are we doing here in New York? So I saw this coming for a good 10 years. And some people said I was a little paranoid and it couldn't happen and I shouldn't be so worried, but I'm a worrier. And so I went to work to build a coalition in the state legislature of people who understood what this issue was and how important it was for our future. And so I created the bipartisan pro-choice legislative caucus for the Assembly and the Senate in New York. We now have 107 members. I think we're the largest caucus. And so as we watched in other state capitals, horrendous anti-reproductive rights laws move forward and actually get passed. In New York State, we didn't let one of those bills move anywhere, and ultimately we were successful in passing what's called the New York State Reproductive Health Act, which was my bill. We passed it in January 2019, and what we did was we took Roe v. Wade and we codified it into New York State's law. So, when the Supreme Court decision comes down, perhaps tomorrow, it doesn't immediately mean that much for New York because we are protected under our law in New York. But we are very, very concerned about several things. One, immediately, we may find that women in 26 states in this country cannot access health care services for themselves in the states they live in, and we expect they will come and travel to New York and California and Illinois and Maryland and Connecticut and other states who have made it clear where we stand on this issue, and we will literally have what I'm calling refugee women from other states come here for their health care. So we knew we needed to make sure we built some protections in for them, because we have other states saying, we're going to get them. What does that mean, we're going to get them? We're going to define as a felony having an abortion. The provider would be a felon, and the woman could be a felon. And we're going to say, in our state law, we don't care if you travel to another state to get that health care service. When you come home, we're going to arrest you. Or if that health care provider accidentally crosses into our state, we're going to arrest them. And they even talked about extradition from New York State and other pro-choice states to their states so that they can bring them to court and potentially put them in jail. So on June 1st, we passed 6 additional laws in New York State, all designed to protect our healthcare providers from this happening to them and to protect patients who might be coming to New York for these healthcare services from facing these risks. And it's hard. We can protect our providers as long as they're here in New York, but we can't necessarily protect the women who come here once they go home again. And we're very, very concerned about that, and we're exploring more and more things that we could do to assure that women would have confidentiality and privacy to come to New York for whatever healthcare services they need, try to make sure we protect that as best we can. But you know, we're living in a world of computer hacking, and you've all gotten, guaranteed, you own a credit card? You've gotten a letter at some point, oops, somebody got your records. They shouldn't have, we're sorry, and we're gonna provide you a 2 years worth of review to make sure that nobody is using your identity and information illegally. Well, the problem with the world we live in, it's not that hard to hack information and to get other people's information. We always have to be on the lookout. So saying we, the state of New York, want to secure the privacy and confidentiality of women who may come here from Texas and Louisiana and Mississippi and Missouri and Alabama and Florida. What went wrong with that state? Anyway, we need to try to protect their rights and their privacy, but it's really hard in a world of computers and counter governments that are challenging what we believe in. And by the way, what I think is really important to understand is public opinion polling shows that 85% of Americans did not want anyone to challenge Roe v. Wade.
Bravo.
Yes, exactly, right? Except we have a Supreme Court that's killing it. And we have state governments with, and I'm in state government, so I'm comfortable saying this, we have state governments with crazy people. Is there anybody here who worked in healthcare in their lives? Doctors, nurses? Okay, there are women here, so you know about pregnancy, and you know about something called an ectopic pregnancy. No one wants an ectopic pregnancy. Nobody tries to get an ectopic pregnancy. It's a mistake of nature. You get pregnant, but it's not inside the womb. It's not in the uterus. It's outside the uterus and it's attached to some organ in your stomach. And it can never be a successful pregnancy, ever. It will end. But it's very likely to kill you if it's not removed. An ectopic pregnancy being ended is not an abortion. The state of Missouri is trying to pass a law that you would be a felon for ending an ectopic pregnancy. They're saying go die because you had a medical emergency. I mean, there are really, really crazy people in state legislatures all over this country, and it's as if they're coming up with these insane ideas each night and saying, oh, I can do another bill on that. So that's a very long answer to an issue that is very complex, will not be solved overnight, and that is one that I am working very hard to do as much as I can to make sure that here in New York, our rights are protected, and I believe we have an obligation to assist women from all over the country to have the same rights and protections that we have here. Long answer.
It was a long answer, but it was an excellent answer because you answered all of my follow-ups before I asked them. So we can move on to a completely different subject because you covered, I believe, 5 follow-ups.
Sorry.
Never apologize for being
compare notes in advance, by the way.
Really didn't. So we're going to move on to some less scary topics for a bit, pep up the room. So I wanted to talk a bit about specifically issues around seniors and aging. Can you talk us through some of what you view as the greatest successes around senior and aging policies during your tenure thus far, and some things that haven't been accomplished yet that you'd like to start accomplishing in the next legislative session?
So I think that we all know, and it has nothing to do with me or the state government, but it is clear that over the 25 years that I've been involved with government, that we have seen modern medicine radically increase the chances for us to live longer, healthier lives, right? Right. And some of you here are proof positive of that. And the fact is that, my parents died in their late 80s and they weren't even considered so old, and yet they outlived most of their own parents by 20 years, and that literally we are able to ensure that people can live longer, healthier, more independent lives. Here's the other side of the story. I think we are socially and culturally totally unprepared for the fact that what we call our older years can now be a 30, 35-year span. So have we thought through making sure people understand that when you're talking about saving for retirement, you're not talking about the 5 to 10 years that your parents or grandparents might have imagined. You're talking about 30 to 35 years, possibly. And I know that in my district office, one of the #1 issues that come to us are people who are in their 60s and 70s saying, I really want to go back to work. I need to go back to work. And yet the labor market thinks that I have no talents or skills. And by the way, the documentation is just the opposite. That employers who don't understand that hiring people in their 60s and 70s who have long-term experience, they make great employees. They have great social skills, great administrative skills. They can learn the new technical issues that people say, oh, you all need to know how to use a computer now. And that they are there for the right reasons, and they are mature adults who can handle complex situations and train younger people. And so I do think the labor market is really missing the boat on this, and that we as society need to think more about what does it mean if the last third of your life is perhaps, when you're 60 and older, and what are you going to do, and how is society going to deal with you, so to speak, and how do we plan for that? There are different needs when you're older. I mean, something as obvious in New York City, I think for you now, as it wasn't for me 20 years ago when my first group of constituents brought this to my attention, quote, Liz, we can't get across the avenues within a light span. We can't walk that fast. And so we get caught not being able to cross major avenues, and we feel like we're prisoners on our own block. And I was like, So I made the Department of Transportation time the walk, don't walk lights on the major avenues in my district. And in fact, then I went and looked at the research on how fast people walk at different ages. And I was like, oh, a kid, no problem. An adult in their 20s, no problem. An adult in their 40s and 50s, no problem. Once you're over your 50s or you have any kind of disability, you're never going to get across in that timeline. So of course you're terrified that the cars are going to hit you because we're not giving you enough time to cross the street. And so we worked with the city of New York, and they extended the walk times across the major avenues. We said a block cross-street crossing is half the distance as an avenue, and you're giving the same time for an avenue or a block. Think about that. All right, so we did that. And they've come up with lots of other interesting things. So now they time it so that even when they're turn lanes, they give you, the walker, advanced time before the turns are allowed to be made. Now it's only 7 seconds, and people say to me that's not enough time. But in the turn lanes are always cross streets, not avenues. And we have all the added complications of bike lanes and restaurants in the middle of streets and all the craziness. But just even thinking about safe streets from the perspective of working with seniors as opposed to kids really requires very different thinking. And I think very different thinking about our culture and our society. So we haven't solved all these things at all. I just see new issues all the time. And I will tell you, I have one very special friend. Her name is Dr. Ruth Westheimer. And I happened to have the opportunity to have lunch with her yesterday. And she said, Liz, we have a new project. You have to get involved with me and you have to help me. I said, yes, Dr. Ruth. And she said, loneliness. And Dr. Ruth is 95 and has more energy than this entire room put together, if you've never had the chance to meet her or see her in action. She said, loneliness is a health crisis. I can show you the statistics, and it's not depression. Depression is real, and depression is real among older people as well as other people. But loneliness is its own health issue, and there are lots of ways to address it, and we're just not thinking about that. And it's disproportionately impacting older people, particularly older people who may have lost their spouses, older people whose children may live far, far away. And she goes, we're gonna deal with this. She said, you're gonna help me become New York State's ambassador for loneliness, and we're gonna work on this. And I told her I would. And she said, good, if you help me with this, I'll promise you a great sex life for the rest of your years. So I went home and told my husband, I've been promised the best sex life if I help Dr. Ruth. We're helping Dr. Ruth. I'm sorry, she's just such a phenomenal woman.
You heard it from the senator first. So.
Sorry I'm outing you, Dr. Ruth, but you were a phenomenal woman. So anyway, that's, I think, my answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I also appreciate that when you reference people in their 20s, you looked at me, and it's kind of you. I'm not in my 20s, but I appreciate it. So keep doing that.
Relative to me,
Yeah,
you're in
keep
your
doing
20s.
it. So you talked about street safety, crossings, timing, just the logistics of navigating New York City as a senior. One of the issues we didn't talk about yet is accessibility of public transportation. We talked about it here last week a bit. Walk us through, well, first of all, why we're not seeing greater improvements in that area. I know that I have disabled and senior members in my family, and I have to think through which stations are actually accessible, which stations are accessible in name only, such as they have elevators, but they're often out of service, or they're incredibly unsanitary, which stations are designed in such a way where parts of it are accessible by elevators, and parts of it seem to have stairs, and it's hard to figure out where to even go.
Yep.
So why are we not seeing quicker improvements in that area, and what can you do to help ensure that the people in this room can more easily access the city, especially in our own neighborhood?
Excellent question. That's a very real issue for so many people. So one problem is New York City's subway system is one of the oldest in the country. So it was built before there were any concepts of elevators or escalators. And modernizing our stations has proved to be extraordinarily expensive and time-consuming. Now, partly that's because the MTA hasn't proved to be very good at their job. I will totally agree. But in fact, they just came out with an announcement, I think yesterday, with a schedule of how many of their stations they would be making accessible by elevator or escalator over a series of, I think, 5-year marks, moving to 2055. I think
I saw that and was horrified.
I know, that's going to take till 2055 to get most of our subway stations.
I thought it was a joke at first, by the way, when I saw 2055 on the graphic.
No, that was real. And it's because of the cost and the time. And then sometimes it's not us, sometimes it's other rules. So for example, the federal government came along and said, you can't put an escalator or an elevator into the sidewalks outside buildings. You have to do them inside buildings. And I felt like going, have you been to Manhattan? What do you mean, like you're going to put it in somebody's building? And they said, no, that's what you need to do. So that means you have to go into usually litigation with somebody who's got a building there already, saying, you want to go through our basement and our lobby? Excuse me? We think we'll sue you and delay that. So that's what happened. 68th Street and Lexington was supposed to have an elevator being built starting 7-8 years ago. And I love my constituents, but I've now had 3 separate buildings sue the MTA, not in my building. And yet, we sort of need to put the elevators in, and they have to go somewhere, and we're not going to move the Lexington Avenue subway because we need access. So sometimes it's not all our fault, and there should be priorities. Now, accessible mass transit isn't just subways, it's buses. And there we've had a little more good news. We have moved into modern designs for buses that bend down, so to speak, to let you on and off, are more accessible by wheelchairs, are wider so that people can actually bring a wheelchair onto the bus. So we've done better there, and now we're going to see whether we can do better while we're moving to an electric bus system, and I'm hoping that we can easily. We also have a complicated and far from perfect system in New York City called Access-a-Ride. I don't know if anybody's tried to use that. So the good news is that if you have enough time in advance to request, if you're elderly or disabled and have been approved for the program, because you have to do that first, and that's not so easy, then you can actually request an Access-a-Ride van, pick you up and take you somewhere for whatever the normal cost of the MTA ride would be. What is it, $3 now about? Depends on whether you have a monthly card.
Tap and pay, I don't see
Yeah,
it.
okay, it's true.
I think it's $3.
I think it's about
It was
$3.
$2.75, and I think it's $3.
it went up.
Yeah.
So, except, one, you need to make sure you're making that appointment way in advance. Two, you have to plan the reality that they're going to be late to pick you up, and late to get you there, and late to come back for you. It's just a fact of life. Now, three, they did set up a model that I loved, where you could have a special card, and like a debit card for Access-a-Ride, and you could use cabs that were participating with their program. And that works quite well if you don't have equipment. You know, if you're wheelchair bound or other equipment needs, that's really tough. But if you're able to get in and out of a regular car or a cab, the Access-a-Ride cab system was actually working pretty effectively. The problem there, the cab companies were trying to charge $60 per trip, and you, the person, are only paying $3 a trip, so who's paying the other $57? And the MTA said, this is going to bankrupt us really quickly. And because it's always money in government services. It's always, who has the money? Do you have enough of it? No, you never have enough of it. And there's just more and more demand. So we're struggling to come up with good solutions because it's not one size fits all. And I'll only say about the 2055 year. I'm also working on Penn Station redevelopment. I have a big hearing on it tomorrow. And I was in a presentation where the state and the city were going over their charts of what was going to happen and payback of the costs. And the charts went out 60 years. And my eyes were starting to like blur. And I actually said in the public meeting, you know, let's stop 25 years out. And they said, why? I said, because I'm going to be dead. So it's actually going to be someone else's problem. So I'm only interested in the first 25 years of work and payback for this plan. I'm disturbed we're talking about it taking 50 to 60 years, but it will be someone younger than me's problem to deal with. Which I thought was funny. They looked a little...
Looking at me again.
I know, well, you're the young one here. But they looked at me like, is she crazy? And I was sort of being funny and sort of being factual. So sometimes massive public projects take an enormous amount of time.
I will say you are a lot of fun in meetings.
Thank you.
You occasionally traumatize your colleagues, but in very good ways, because sometimes people just don't want to deal with facts, you know? So, staying on the subject of infrastructure, we look out here, we see this beautiful water line, but we are also one storm away from something really bad happening, including right here in this building.
Yes, we're in a floodplain, technically.
Well, as last year demonstrated, a bit more than technically, as we walk into the subway stations and there's literally waterfalls and people are having to swim their way out. So what are we doing about the fact that we have this public transportation system and sewer system that is not designed for the amount of water that is coming in, and we're dealing with a seawall over there that is not particularly protective. You got plans for this?
So there are a bunch of different plans. One, of course, all of this is correlated to climate change. Why are we suddenly seeing higher water levels, major flooding, once a century storms every 2 years? Not good. It's all related to climate change. So what we do about climate change is we'd have to have another session just to talk about that. But we're working very hard to come up with some solutions at the state level. But what we know is we need to increase resiliency and what's called mitigation, fancy words for how are we going to build it back better? How are we going to
Nice Biden right there.
There you go. How are we going to make sure that there are new rules of the road for anyone building anything? So this building is what, maybe 2.5 years old? It was opened a little over a year ago. So it was probably completed construction-wise maybe 2 years ago, I'm pretending. But my point is, when it was starting to be built, there were already new New York City laws in place about what the construction had to be and how it had to be, because of its closeness to the water. The architect, whoever it was, had to redesign and get approval for buildings that can handle flooding that's not going to impact the residential areas and is not going to blow out your entire electrical system. Because as we learned from recent major storms impacting Manhattan, where many of our major hospitals are right there on the river. We had major hospitals that were completely flooded, had to close, and perhaps more disturbingly, had their entire utility system blow up, never to be able to be repaired. So when we were talking as governments, what are we going to do here? We're not going to move NYU, Bellevue, Mount Sinai South. Mount Sinai North is farther inland, it didn't have a problem. New York Cornell, special surgery, Memorial Sloan Kettering, all the hospitals are here along the river. And so the city decided, and the state backed them, that any building of hospitals or any rebuilding of hospitals would require that they never put their mechanicals in the basement again. Because we couldn't risk that happening again. We can't move them and we can't close the river. So it's really required thinking through how we build things, how we rebuild things. You referenced the seawall. The seawall's been collapsing for about 20 years in different places. And I still get the discussions of, well, it's the city of New York, so they have to fix it. But that FDR right there that you're seeing with the cars on it, that's state. So I'm like, when the FDR collapses into the river, I think it's a state problem. So maybe we should fix the seawall before the FDR collapses into the East River. And I've won some of those fights and lost some of those fights. Literally, because no, I happen to know the FDR is the states. But Manhattan Island is the cities. We need to coordinate. Then you have the federal government who oversees everything that happens on the river. And they also have a stake in it. So we have to deal with these things. Although it turns out, here's the bad news for us up here. Lower Manhattan is much more at risk than we are. So everybody's prioritizing, let's try to save Lower Manhattan. Now I don't disagree. I don't like Wall Street some days, but I don't really want to watch it sink into the water. And we've done a lot of building of everything down there. And we have to reconstruct the parks in Battery Park City and along the East River and along the Hudson to make sure that they are 10, 15 feet higher up so that we protect against these incredible storms and the rising seas. So we have to be planning for all this. And government's not always great at planning. The truth is, we're more reactive by nature, and we jump in emergencies. And then when you talk about how do you prevent the emergencies in the first place, sometimes we all look at each other going, oh, that's a radical idea. But I actually am a big believer in trying to plan for things that we think are going to happen, even if it's not here yet.
I appreciate something that comes through when you're talking a lot is that you're a big proponent of proactive rather than reactive politics. Even starting at the beginning of this conversation when you said, I saw this coming 10 years ago and I got to work. And I think that's something that we'd like to see from more of our elected officials in general, so thank you.
You're welcome.
So there should be a staffer somewhere with a third microphone. I don't want to have to do this Phil Donahue style where I just walk up to audience members.
You're not even old enough to remember Phil Donahue. Oh my God. We know Phil Donahue.
I'm not in my 20s, no matter how hard you try to push this narrative. Is it you, my friend? Yes. Does the microphone work today?
It does.
Wonderful. Okay, who would like to ask the senator a question? Let's see a hand, do not be shy. Oh, here we
All
go.
right.
It's not a question. There is another way of getting accessible transportation. Not everybody knows about it. It's an accessible taxi where you call, the taxi comes for you. You can call it again to take you home, but you have to pay what's on the meter. So it's really for people who have a little extra money,
Yeah.
but who need some transportation in an emergency. Now, I've used it for many years, and they've always been very good, except that it's expensive. But it was worth it to me because the regular accessible transportation was impossible. I mean, we had people who took us from the east side to the west side to the east side to the west side who couldn't find the address. So I switched to this group.
She's referring to Uber, I believe.
It is not an Uber.
Oh, it is?
No.
It's a regular yellow taxi.
Okay.
That's run by the MTA.
Well, that is their accessorized system within the
Yeah, and
MTA.
it has a,
Yeah.
and the accessorized system.
Right.
So
But of
as I
course,
said, if you can afford to pay.
that's right, if you can afford to pay, and again, as this other lady pointed
It's
out,
very reliable.
right, Ubers are also a completely new phenomena that has changed transportation in the city. You know, they've actually both made it harder for taxis to survive, but they've also forced competition and improvement in quality. So I think there's pluses and minuses about this massive expansion.
Catch 22.
It is a catch-22 of Uber, but you're both right that those are other options that are available. And I don't know whether, I think I just read that because of COVID, they had stopped the ride-sharing system in some of the private car companies, Uber, but that they're about to start it again. Which means if you're prepared to let other people in the cab with you, going somewhere perhaps nearby, that it saves the money because it lets people decrease the cost because they know there might be 3 people going 3 different places, they're each paying a third. So that had apparently ended during COVID, and I just read that they're planning on starting that up. Other questions? Stumped everyone. Yes.
The first discussion was very good, and I thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Do you have any further comments on that issue?
On the gun issue or the abortion rights issue? Well, I do think that we should all wait to read the newspapers tomorrow to see what the Supreme Court has decided. There are a small number of people who think that because the decision was leaked and it threw off the court that this was exposed before they were ready, that the court might not go as far as we all think they will. Justice Roberts, who's the chief judge, while he's never been a supporter of abortion rights, talks a lot, and some of his decisions show that he doesn't want damage to the institution of the Supreme Court. He doesn't want damage to the reputation of the Supreme Court. And I think there has been plenty of evidence because of the leak and what it's said the court intended to do that has triggered a huge amount of pushback. And perhaps he will succeed in some way with moderating whatever this decision is. I'm not sure if it's possible. We'll see. The other thing I didn't mention that I should have is something else that could happen that has not happened yet, is that the Congress of the United States could pass law that established the right to abortion that would apply to all 50 states. The U.S. House of Representatives has already passed that law. The U.S. Senate has not been able to get the votes to pass it. So that would be critical and important, and so that's not for the court, but in response to the court decision, that is something that I hope could possibly happen soon in the U.S. Senate. And when I say soon, I emphasize soon because we all have elections in November, and I'm not trying to get partisan here, but there's a decent chance my party, the Democratic Party, ends up losing one or both houses. If we do, we could face a Congress that does the exact reverse, passes federal law outlawing abortion throughout this country. Their law is bigger than my law. It's what's called superseding authority. So if we have a federal government that outlaws abortion in this country, it doesn't matter how many great laws I was able to pass in New York. We're still part of the United States of America. And then you're in, now what are you going to do? I will tell you my humorous but not serious response.
Those are most of your responses.
I came up with an alternative for us when we had that man named Trump as the president, and it was driving me crazy. And people kept talking about I'm leaving the country. And I was like, why do I have to leave? I didn't do anything wrong. We should offer ourselves to Canada as the new province. We have a lot to give New York State. We're a fabulous state with all kinds of economic success and natural resources. If this country is going to go crazy, I'm prepared to make a deal and we can become Canadians. They have great senses of humor. They have national health care. I like their prime minister. And just for the record, their national anthem is so much easier to sing than ours.
Is this the news you want to be making right now?
I've said this many times. So, and in fact, I'm having a little fight with Canada over one of my bills, and they had heard me say it and said, but I think you want to come to us eventually. I was like, well, not if we can't work out this issue, but, you know, it's a challenge. Democracy is a delicate model, and we're only a couple of 100 years old. And we better figure out how, as a country, we move forward together, or we can really see some terrifying things in our future.
One of my concerns is a constitutional crisis that would come down from the Supreme Court issuing rulings that are so extreme that states choose to defy the court. What do you think we would do here in New York if we saw that happen? If we saw abortion unilaterally outlawed, would the state of New York just say, that doesn't apply here, we're not gonna countenance that?
It's very hard to picture what would happen other than to reference history. My father always told me people need to read history and remember history because they get themselves in a lot of trouble when they don't. So this country had something called the Civil War. Remember? I mean, none of us were there, but we all studied it. And it grew out of the fact that ultimately some states said, we're holding on to slavery, and other states said, it's not acceptable, we can't continue this, and ultimately we ended up breaking up in as a country into two sides fighting a war, and our whole history changed because of that. We did get rid of slavery, that was the good news, but we had a civil war. When I read the potential impacts of the decisions of the Supreme Court, I reflect back on the history pre the Civil War. What started the fight? And it was a bill called the Escaped Slave Act. And it was a federal law that said, if you're a slave and you ran away from your owner and you went to a free state and tried to live as a free person, that owner or that slave state had the right to come into New York or Connecticut or New England and take you back, even though you were living in a non-slave state. They had the right to extradite you. They had the right, because you were property, not a human being, to shoot you for running away in the first place. And these incidents were happening all over the country, increasing the anger on both sides, increasing the confrontations between different states. I read that history and I go, that sounds an awful lot like where the Supreme Court might be pushing us into. So I don't know what New York will do. I certainly don't want to have to live through a civil war. And I do know that the vast majority of Americans are on my side of this issue, despite the Supreme Court, and that hopefully saner people would take over state legislatures. And there's also, I guess, one more proposal that I'm not sure how real it could possibly be, that we expand the number of judges on the Supreme Court so that we add judges who aren't in this extremist camp, and we start to reverse the decisions we now seem to be seeing from them on a regular basis.
I appreciate your reflection on history there. I always remind people we did win the last Civil War, so it'd be better if we don't need to do that again, but we have a record of the good side winning. So we're reaching the end of our time here today, so I want to give you a chance to tell us your final thoughts. I would say make your final pitch to voters, but you are running unopposed, so
Well,
you were a write-in.
In November, I think I will have an election, we will see. And I will just say, for the record, I never take anyone's vote for granted. And when I first ran for office in 2000, everyone in the world except my family knew I would lose. They were just like, no, you're going to lose. Everybody likes the Republican state senator. He's been here forever. Some of you probably knew him and voted for him. His name was Roy Goodman, and he was around for 32 years. And I was just told I didn't stand a chance. And it didn't upset me that much. I thought it was worth the fight anyway. And so we actually ended up in a 6.5-week recount of a tied election. And then his party said, she'll beat you in 2 years. We run every 2 years. So you should get out, and we're going to run a younger, cuter Republican to keep the seat. And so then I had a special election, and I won that. And they were like, oh, we can get rid of her in the next general because we'll find a billionaire to run against her, which they did. And he outspent me, I think, 10-1. But I beat him. And so I went from somebody who could never win to someone who took out the 3 remaining elected Republicans in Manhattan. Now, since then, it is true it has gotten easier for me in elections. But I'm quite sure I know why. One, I have the best staff in government. If you ever need my office for anything, you will then later tell me, wow, those people were great. And I know that. And I think that might be my one skill in life. I know how to hire really good people. 2, I take every day in this job as a day that I'm working for my constituents, and I'm out there and getting to know them. And if you do that, when it comes around to election time, people go, oh no, we know Liz, we'll vote for Liz, which makes it harder for my opponents, I have to say. And I don't think it's that hard to do my job, be honest with people. I have many, many Republicans who will actually say on election day, damn it, you're too liberal for me, and yet I'm going to vote for you again. And I always say, well, you don't have to, they're Republicans to vote for. And they'll actually say, you're honest, you're principled, and you're hardworking. Even if I don't agree with you on anything, I think that's probably qualifications for the job. So I say thank you. I don't mind taking your vote, even if you think I'm too liberal. My father always thought I was too liberal. We joked in my family that my father was a Republican and my mother was a socialist, and they got me. It's true. And he stopped being a Republican when I ran for office because I was like, Dad, it's really embarrassing and I couldn't need your vote. You're going to have to register Democrat. He's like, can't I just be an independent? I go, no, I might really need the vote. And since I did lose my first election after a 6.5-week recount, I pointed out, see, I really needed every vote. So I'm glad I got you to change for me. Anyway, I really appreciate your inviting me here tonight. Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Sustained applause.
When are you coming back?
We'll invite her back, don't worry.
Okay.
But our next event will be a congressional forum with your incumbent, Carolyn Maloney, and her challengers. So make sure you join us for that.
When will that be?
That is a question for Evan.
To be continued. To be
That is
decided.
correct.
Okay, thanks.
It's a couple of weeks.
Fabulous.
Have a great night.